Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Southern Ohio Museum and Cultural Center. My name is Heidi Bender-Kaufman and I'm the museum educator here. Some of you I've met before and I'm looking forward to meeting the rest of you. Tonight we have Alex Armstrong presenting his thesis presentation, Historic Mound Cemeteries in the Upper Ohio Valley. So, Alex Armstrong grew up exploring the mounds and other historic sites of Athens County, Ohio. He graduated from Ohio University with a BA in French in 2020 and is currently pursuing a master's in geography at OU, where his research focus is the mound cemeteries of Ohio and Indiana. And Alex told me today that he went into geography specifically so that he could conduct research on this topic. Ohio and surrounding states were once the heartland of America's mound-building indigenous peoples, including well-known Adena and Hopewell cultures. Beginning in the 18th century, European settlers began locating their own cemeteries on and around these ancient burial mounds. In this talk, Alex will explore the distribution and morphology of these mound cemeteries, nearly 100 of which dot the landscape of Ohio and Indiana. Using genealogical, archival, and field methods, Alex will propose some explanations as to where these sites fit within our cultural landscape and what they can tell us about the settler groups behind this unique reappropriation of sacred space. So without further ado, Alex Armstrong.
Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Yes, this project's been it's been in the works for a long time. I'm really happy to share the results of it with you all. Does anybody, as we get started, does anybody recognize this image? And I know we have somebody in the audience who definitely does, who could tell you a lot about it from our historical perspective, but does anybody know where this is? Jeff?
Marietta.
This is Marietta. This is what the site looks like today. It's Mound Cemetery in Marietta. It's a pretty famous historic site. If you have read David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, about the settlement of Marietta, if you've ever been to Marietta, this is one of the top historical sites people like to go see. They say it's supposed to be the most revolutionary officers in any cemetery in the country. In any case, there's this beautiful Adena mound that was later integrated into a Hopewell earthworks complex that survives in the cemetery. It's probably the best preserved component of the Marietta earthworks to survive, and so people visit it for that as well as for the Revolutionary War history and the pioneer history. So that interests me, this multi-layer, multi-component historic site. And then before we progress further, a lot of you probably are fairly well informed about the archaeological background that we're talking about, but in case anybody's new to those topics, the two most important mound building cultures in the history of this region are what we call the Adena culture, who flourished roughly between 500 BC and AD 100, and the Hopewell culture, who flourished a little later than that, up till about AD 500. If you're familiar with the relatively recent UNESCO World Heritage designation for Ohio's earthworks, that's the Hopewell culture. So those are the people who built these mounds in the first place, well over 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. But I want to look at more recent history. I showed you the Mound Cemetery in Marietta, and I was surprised to learn, probably in high school, that there's a mound cemetery in my hometown in Athens, a much smaller mound, as you can see. This is in Mount Calvary, the Catholic cemetery in Athens. But it's the same kind of landscape. It's this ancient burial site that is surrounded by more recent Euro-American graves. So that interested me. I very quickly started to realize these mound cemeteries are all over the place. So here's 6 images of different mound cemeteries, and these are actually just from Athens County and Meigs County in southeast Ohio. So this is immediately in my neck of the woods. And actually, since then, I've found another one in Athens County that's not even pictured up here. So that kind of gives you a sense of the ubiquity of mound cemeteries. By the time I kind of realized how common they were, I wanted to study why. And nobody's really written about why previously. Why European and European descended settlers came into Ohio and buried their dead loved ones at these ancient sites. So in order to answer why, first, I just wanted to figure out as best I could how many of these are there and where are they. I eventually honed my study area down to Ohio and Indiana because I was able to get data on archaeological sites from those two states. And it's a good study area, not too big, not too small. So what you see up here, any township that is colored yellow, there's one mound cemetery in that township. Bright red, 2 mound cemeteries in that township. Dark red is 3. So we're down here in Scioto County. But if you go over into Adams, that's a very interesting, dense little cluster of mound cemeteries in Greene and Monroe townships down in Adams. But they're all over the place. I mean, look at that. I think my last count for the 2 states was 104 mound cemetery sites. So I'm in the geography department at OU, and a lot of cultural geographers of the old school, they see a cultural trait, like a certain type of barn or a certain type of house, and they say, where in Europe did that come from? What group of European immigrants brought that to the New World? So you can kind of start looking in that direction with mound cemeteries. There are graveyards in England where there are ancient burial mounds with more modern graves around them. Likewise in France, you find them all over the old world. So that's one possible route of explanation. And I just couldn't find any real evidence to support it. There's no documentation that suggests somebody in Ohio buried a loved one at a mound site because they were familiar with sites like that in England. And really, if you think about it, there are few mounds on the East Coast. Certainly, the ancient landscape there is very different from our own. You don't find any mound cemeteries in Tidewater, Virginia, or in the Hudson Valley. So as settlers came to the New World, there was a geographic break where people lived on the East Coast for a few generations before anybody really crossed over the Alleghenies to our area. So even if there was kind of an ancestral memory of mound cemeteries in the Old World, it would have been lost during that sequence of migration. Okay, so we need another explanation. Geographers and many scholars, of kind of a more contemporary approach would really look at a lot of these as, a colonialist appropriation of a native sacred site. That's another explanation that it's pretty easy to think of and you want to investigate. You look at the recent history, the history since settlement of these mound sites, and a lot of it's very unfortunate. People not treating these sites with respect, right? Destroying sites, sometimes out of necessity, you have to plow your field. Sometimes out of simple curiosity, you want to dig it up and find the skulls that are in there and put them on the mantelpiece. And I don't think this necessarily explains the mound cemeteries either, because when you start looking at the available documentation, somebody who wanted to themselves be buried or to bury a loved one at the mound site on their farm would tend to speak and write about that site with a certain degree of respect and reverence. And so the image shows a very small cemetery, just one grave in Morgan County. There's a farmer called John Barry who died in 1924. And he put this in his will that he wanted to be buried there, and he left very specific instructions. And the people who dug his grave, they found bones, and they found pipes, and they found relics, and they put all that stuff back in the grave. That was what John Barry wanted. So that shows to me a degree of reverence and respect for these sites. Even if we would not necessarily consider cemetery use an appropriate reuse of somebody else's sacred site today, it's not simply, this is the conquered people, we're going to put our stuff there instead. So we need another explanation still. In Marietta, people love to talk about how the founders of Marietta were interested in historic preservation before almost anybody else in this country was interested in historic preservation. Marietta was settled in 1788 by the Ohio Company of Associates, who came from mostly Massachusetts and Connecticut. They found this sprawling earthwork complex, And right off the bat, almost as soon as they stepped off the boat, they said, we're going to take the most impressive parts of that earthwork complex and designate that as public squares, public land, and we're going to try and preserve those sites. And in some cases it worked, in some cases it didn't. But the idea behind a cemetery is, well, that is a non-destructive land use. We do not yet have a cultural idea of putting aside an ancient site purely for historic preservation. You have to find a use for the land that is utilitarian, but that won't destroy it. So we put a graveyard there. Nobody's going to build a house on the graveyard. Nobody's going to plow it down. That will preserve the mound. And you hear people talking about the Marietta Mound Cemetery in those terms quite often. And so for a while, I was kind of investigating the idea of, well, was that kind of the driving force between a lot of these sites? I don't think it was, just because Marietta stands out as unique. You don't find other sites where people write, well, we're going to put the cemetery here because we know that will save the mound. So even if that was in the back of people's heads, it very may well have been on their minds in some cases. I don't think that's the overarching explanation. There's one other site where a kind of a sacred site preserves an ancient site, and that is in Independence, Ohio. In the 1850s, the pastor of the Congregational Church there ordered this petroglyph slab set into the church to preserve it. So that's another kind of preservationist example, but I still don't think that's the universal explanation. So at this point, you might be wondering, and a lot of people have kind of asked this, said, hey, Alex, there are thousands of mounds in Ohio, there are thousands of cemeteries. Sometimes those are going to overlap, right? This picture is from a cemetery west of Columbus. It's called the Bigelow Cemetery. And those red flowers are a beautiful native prairie plant, the royal catchfly, that is virtually extirpated from the state of Ohio. One of the only places that it survives is in this little cemetery because the land was never plowed. But nobody's going to come in here and say the Bigelow family located their cemetery there to preserve this native plant. That's ridiculous. It's coincidence. And it's fortunate coincidence. So a lot of archaeologists that I've spoken to have said, well, yeah, of course, sometimes mound sites and cemetery sites are going to coincide because in many cases the mound builders favored high ground because it won't flood and for other reasons. And historic pioneers didn't want their cemeteries on ground that was going to flood. So there's practical reasons why these things should coincide. And the devil's advocate says, well, it's just coincidence. If that were true, you would expect that wherever there are more mounds, there would be more mound cemeteries. But that's not the case. There are a lot of mound cemeteries in the lower Miami and Little Miami Valley. There's a lot of mounds there, so that links up. Likewise, Licking County has a couple of them. Licking County has a lot of mounds, but look at the Scioto Valley. Look at Ross and Pickaway counties, right? Densest concentration of mounds in the state. And this map doesn't show every mound in Ohio, but it gives you a good impression of the relative concentration of them. Look at Ross and Pickaway counties on the map of mound cemeteries. One each. If it was just that wherever there are more mounds, there are more mound cemeteries, you would expect Ross and Pickaway to have a lot of them, and they just don't. You can actually express this as a ratio to really compare it. Of the mounds that were marked on the map I just showed you, the 1914 Mills map, Mills notes 419 mounds in Ross County. Of those 419, one was turned into a mound cemetery in Richmonddale. Now, Medina County is up in northeast Ohio in the Old Western Reserve. Mills found 9 mounds in Medina County. And there are 2 mound cemeteries there. So in Ross County, in the Scioto Valley, 1 out of every 419 mounds got turned into a cemetery. In Medina County, 1 out of every 4.5 mounds got turned into a cemetery. That suggests it's not just pure coincidence, right? There is some other factor at play that's going to explain the distribution of these sites. And to do that, we have to look at who settled Ohio in the first place. Ohio was settled by 4 major groups of people. In terms of settlers who were born in the United States, The south of Ohio was largely settled by Virginians and people who, their parents or grandparents came from Virginia. The north of Ohio was largely settled by New Englanders. This was the Western Reserve. It was land that was originally held by Connecticut to pay their Revolutionary War soldiers off. So New Englanders in this northern strip, Southerners along the river, most of Ohio was mostly settled by Pennsylvanians. A lot of Pennsylvanians who, going back several generations, were of German descent. The fourth major group of people who settled Ohio were immigrants who came directly from foreign countries, mostly Ireland and Germany. That pie chart shows the relative proportions. It shows you that mid-Atlantic, which is mostly Pennsylvanians, were the pretty significant plurality of settlers of Ohio. Now, this map of settler groups does not really yet explain the map of mound cemeteries. If you put them side by side, I can't really see any identifiable pattern. So we can't just look at gross patterns of where the most Pennsylvanians were, where the most Virginians were. We have to look at the actual people who started each cemetery. Who was the first person buried in the cemetery? Oftentimes, when settlers would enter Ohio, the first person to die, unfortunately, would be a young child. Who were the parents who buried that first child in a new community? Or maybe it was, the husband or the wife or grandma or grandpa. But you can find a lot of that information on online genealogical sources. I used findagrave.com for a lot of this stuff. It's a great resource. And what I found is this. The pie chart on the, from your perspective, the pie chart on the left, those are the settler groups in Ohio. Largest proportion from the mid-Atlantic states, which is Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The other pie chart, these are the settlers who established all of the mound cemetery sites I've been able to identify. And you can see, same color, the mid-Atlantic settlers established very few mound cemeteries. It's just, that's interesting. The New England, the northeastern settlers, established a really, really disproportionate number of mound cemeteries. If you want to compare these directly, bear with me for this. You can put together a very simple equation. You take the number of settlers from each group who came into Ohio. You take the number of mound cemeteries attributable to each group. And if you solve for a variable that makes the equation work, essentially you can control for the uneven number of each settler group. You can say, for every 1,000 settlers from Pennsylvania, for every 1,000 settlers from Virginia, how many mound cemeteries did they establish? And that's what these numbers allow us to compare. Once you control for the different settler group sizes, you see that people from New England were more than twice as likely to establish a mound cemetery as anybody from any other settler group. So it's the New Englanders, really it is. It's people who were born in Connecticut and Massachusetts and Vermont. It's people who were born in upstate New York, but whose parents were born in Connecticut and Massachusetts and Vermont. Most of New York State was settled directly from the New England coast. So there is a historical geographer named Wilbur Zielinski who did a very famous study on the culture traits that were spread westward by New England settlers coming into Ohio and other western states. He looked at classical town names. So I'm from Athens, Ohio. Why is there a town in Ohio named after, the center of learning in ancient Greece? We kind of take that for granted in America. There's lots of towns in America with classical names. Syracuse, New York, that kind of stuff. But that wasn't always the case. No town was named after classical Greece or Rome until after the Revolution. And really, Wilbur Zielinski, he showed that classical town names as a cultural idea first arose in upstate New York between 1790 and 1800. You get a lot of towns named after ancient Greece and Rome during that time period. Those settlers who had come from Connecticut and Massachusetts, note there are not classical town names in Connecticut and Massachusetts. It was the people who had been born there and settled west who started doing that. Well, they start bringing it down into Pennsylvania. They start bringing it down into Ohio, into Indiana and Illinois and Kentucky. By the 1820s, People are doing it in Alabama. The cultural idea of classical town names had started with New Englanders and then diffused throughout the culture. People saw, oh, they named a town, Syracuse in New York. That's a cool idea. I'm going to name my town Rome in Georgia, whatever. You look at old New England cemeteries, and cemeteries settled or started by New England settlers in Ohio. You see a lot of names like Seneca, a lot of names like Homer. The people were naming their kids after classical Greece and Rome too. I think that's why they were establishing the mound cemeteries. In the early 1800s, there was kind of a cultural craze around the mound builders. People were digging up these fantastic relics, and they were imagining all kinds of historical or fantastical stories about the people who built those mounds. So this is an illustration from a book from that time period. They're imagining that the mound builders are having this huge, crazy battle on one of the mounds, which is a little ludicrous, but it was very much in the pop culture at the time. People were imagining the mounds to be America's version of antiquity. So these people were really interested in the antiquity of the old world, in Greece and Rome, but they also wanted to have a version of it for themselves, and the mound builders supplied that want. This poem it was published in 1833 by William Cullen Bryant, one of the most prominent American poets of the time period. It's called "The Prairies," and I'm gonna read this for you real quick, if that's all right. Are they here, the dead of other days? And did the dust of these fair solitudes once stir with life and burn with passion? Let the mighty mounds that overlook the rivers, or that rise in the dim forest crowded with old oaks, answer. A race that long has passed away built them, a disciplined and populous race, heaped with long toil the earth, while yet the Greek was hewing the Pentelicus to forms of symmetry, and rearing on its rock the glittering Parthenon. So this is a very long poem, and that's just a small extract from it. It's all about musing on the ancient mound builders and the passing of different peoples from the course of history. But I want to highlight this passage because it sets up a very direct comparison. Mound builders and Greeks, right? The mound builders are they're heaping earth to make their great works, while the Greeks were, the Pentelicus is the marble quarry where they cut the marble to build the Parthenon. Mound builders making great works out of earth, Greeks making great works out of marble. The comparison couldn't be any more direct. William Cullen Bryant was imagining the mound builders to be America's great civilization. It's great classical antique civilization, just like Europe had the Greeks. I really think that explains the mound cemeteries. They were at their most popular in the 1820s and 30s, which was when this neoclassicism was at its height in America, when this, the poetry and the books and the plays about the mound builders were at their height. So if you look at which settler groups, if you look at all settler groups together, mound cemeteries were at their most popular in the 1820s and 30s, and that's the graph on the left. The graph on the right is a little disorganized and confused, but it breaks it up by settler group. Mound cemeteries hit their peak earliest among settlers from the Northeast, from New England essentially. Each other culture group peaked later. So it's the same phenomenon that you see in Wilbur Zielinski's classical town names. The phenomenon originates among New Englanders, and then other people pick it up, think it's a great idea, copy it, spread it. As for why it's New Englanders, I don't know in concrete terms, but cultural geographers have written a fair bit about how a lot of elements of early American culture originated first among people in New England and of New England descent, and then were disseminated to other groups. They were just kind of on the forefront of American culture at that time. Architecturally, artistically, literarily, and it seems in terms of funerary culture too. But actually the first mound cemetery that we can identify was in Pittsburgh, very head of the Ohio River, and there is some evidence to suggest that the French, who were at what we call today Pittsburgh, they called it Fort Duquesne, in the 1750s, may have buried the soldiers who died at Fort Duquesne at a mound site, which was located not far up the point. That's where the fort was, around about there, in what is today downtown Pittsburgh. Most of that cemetery is gone now, including where the mound site was. We know there was a mound there. We know that it was used at least as far back as the British Fort Pitt in the 1760s. It might very well go back a little farther than that to the French occupation of the site. You can't see the mound today. Part of the cemetery is still there. The rest has been built over. If you're familiar with Pittsburgh, those red awnings across the street in that image, that's the Duquesne Club, which is, the very fancy high culture social club in Pittsburgh. From Pittsburgh, the Mound Cemetery spread out into Ohio. Marietta was not the next one. The next one, as far as I can tell, was actually in Tiltonsville, Ohio, which is in Jefferson County, not too far from Steubenville. But Marietta was founded quite early on. If you look up Mound Cemetery, you'll get an establishment date of 1801, but actually the idea to turn it into a cemetery came up in 1800. But the early pioneers of Marietta had in 1788 or 1789, they had done a small excavation on the top of the mound. They had discovered bones. They recognized, oh, this is a tomb. We now know that at least this part of the earthworks is a burial site. Not too far after that, I think about 1790, 1791, the Ohio Company passed a resolution. They passed a resolution for how they were going to landscape all these different public squares. They were going to have such and such types of trees over here, such and such types of trees over there. The square around what is now Mound Cemetery got willows and evergreens in it. None of the other squares got that treatment. Those are the two trees that really are associated with cemeteries, that are associated with death and mourning. And even as early as 1790, they were planting those trees at what would become Mound Cemetery, which is very interesting to me. In any case, the cemetery itself received its first burial in 1801, and it quickly became a tourist attraction. The image on the left, actually Jeff Wilson brought my attention to that image. It's a charcoal sketch from about 1818 by an artist who lived for a while in Marietta, Charles Sullivan. You start seeing Mound Cemetery come up in the sketches in diaries of travelers who went through the region. You start seeing it in postcards. You start seeing it in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper, 1888. It became a tourist attraction really early on, and people would see this cool ancient tomb surrounded by the graves of the pioneers, and they'd write back to Boston, and they'd write back to New York City, and they'd say, I went out west to the wilds of Ohio, and this is one of the very interesting things I saw. So I really think that the Marietta Mound Cemetery is quite likely responsible for a lot of the spread of mound cemeteries because it was on the public mind. If you knew about a historic site in Ohio in the early 1800s, this is what it was. It was Marietta's Mound Cemetery. In Indiana, there's another cemetery which plays a very similar role. It is the Old Harmonist Cemetery in New Harmony, which is in far southwest Indiana. This was also visited by a lot of early tourists and travelers. And actually, if you look at the map of Indiana and of Ohio, the most mound cemeteries in Ohio cluster around Marietta's. And not necessarily the most in Indiana, but there is a significant cluster of them around New Harmony. So I think some of these early mound cemeteries that became well known are responsible for spreading the cultural form. But there were other mechanisms through which these would spread. Family connections is an obvious one. Here is a mound cemetery in Jackson County and one in Hocking County. So they're not terribly far away, but there's Vinton between them. But there's family links between these two cemeteries. The people who went and settled the one were related to the people who went and settled the other. And so we can only speculate about what letters would have gone back and forth, what visits, who did it first. It was the James one, and Jackson did it first. But to what extent that inspired the branch of the family who was out in the Big Pine Valley in Hocking County to do it too. Transportation routes, of course, played a role in the spread of mound cemeteries. The river is an obvious one. The Ohio the Wabash, the Muskingum. Those were the early routes of travel. But later on, railroads would have played a significant role. I love this example. So, are you familiar with St. Sylvester? It's okay, yeah, it's up the hill from Zaleski. Zaleski is this old mining town founded by a railroad company in the 1850s. And originally this was there was a Catholic section and a secular section in this cemetery. Today it's all Catholic. There was a little mound in this cemetery. Now, Zaleski, because it was a railroad town and a mining town and an iron furnace town, that attracted a lot of immigrants from Ireland and other predominantly Catholic countries. It became a very early center of Catholicism in Southeast Ohio. So even though today Zaleski is a very small town, that's where the priest lived. And the priest would serve the smaller congregations by train. He would take the train from Zaleski to Athens, give a mass, take the train back all the way to Jackson, give a mass. This went on for a couple decades. In the later 1800s, the Catholic communities of Southeast Ohio, centered on Zaleski, were connected by railroad. And you have this very interesting cluster of Catholic mound cemeteries in those three towns. Zaleski came first, then Athens, then Jackson. All three towns have a Catholic mound cemetery. And I would love to find better documentation about there was a sequence of priests who were kind of running this circuit. But of the 5 Catholic mound cemeteries I know, that's 3 of them. And so you have to wonder, those communities were so tightly connected, you wonder how those ideas spread. So I want to shift gears a little bit and just show you some pictures mostly, but talk about what I've called the morphology of mound cemeteries. What do these places look like when you go see them? Most important thing to start with is they're not all actually mound sites. So Piketon is another fairly well-known mound cemetery. It's just up Route 23 if you ever get a chance to visit. That really is an ancient archaeological site. Those mounds were built, 2,000-ish years ago. The other image of the Dolly Cemetery in Hocking County is not a mound, but there is enough historic documentation that tells us that the community who lived in that area in the early to mid 1800s, they believed that this little hilltop was an Indian mound. So from my point of view, that counts. That is the same historic phenomenon. If people in 1820 believed they were burying their loved ones at a mound site, then for me, it's a mound cemetery. I can't remember what the ratio is. It's a little over half of the sites that I found are actually, I think, bona fide Indian mound sites, and then a large-ish minority are just natural features. You find about an even split as to whether there are historic period burials in the mound or whether just around the mound. Really, it's the small mounds where people didn't have any problem carrying the coffin and digging a grave on top, but nobody wanted to carry the coffin up a bigger mound, I think, is why you see larger mounds left clear of graves more often. Long Bottom is in Meigs County. Beautiful little cemetery with that dry stone wall around it. Newtown is an eastern suburb of Cincinnati.
There's actually 2 mounds in that.
There are, yes. There's a smaller one too, and the smaller one has graves just laid right over it as though the mound wasn't there. Whereas the big one is the centerpiece, and the graves wrap around it.
Although on the back side, they do go up there.
Just a little bit, yeah. And that's not to say you find graves on the summit of big mounds sometime. Piketon is a perfect example. There is a Revolutionary War veteran right on the summit of that mound, and then his wife's tilted little tombstone is kind of 3/4 of the way up it. So when I'm studying the people who establish these mound cemeteries, cemeteries are a great thing for the cultural geographer to study because there's so much there in terms of cultural material. You get to see the art styles they were using, the materials they were using. Were they using local stone? Were they importing fine marble on the railroad? So I just want to show you a little gallery of some of the folk art. The image on the far left is one of the most beautiful gravestones I've ever seen. That is in the Hodgins Mound Cemetery in Tiltonsville in Jefferson County. There's no name on that stone. It's just that really pretty curly Q heart. The image in the center is cool because it's very typical of what we think of as like Pennsylvania Dutch style folk art, the floral motif at the top. And then on the right, I included that image just to say that folk art is not always antique. That is a pretty recent gravestone, 1960s. It's not a gravestone. It's two pieces of pipe welded together, and the name and date of the person are a bead of weld on that pipe. So that's homemade. That's folk art, and that says something about the people who are using that cemetery. Sometimes the art is less in a folk style. It's more in like what an art historian or a cultural geographer would think of as a more standardized style. There are symbols that are associated with funerals, with mourning. So up in Muskingum County, we have this winged cherub head. That's actually a very antique funeral symbol that you don't find a lot in Ohio. You find that a lot more in Massachusetts, say. That obelisk is from the 1840s or 50s, and that would have been a really outdated image to use by that time. But the central image, that was right up to date. That's in Richmondale and Ross County. The very stylized willow tree and the urn, classic funeral symbols. The hand pointing upward to heaven, very classic funeral symbol, or funerary symbol. Of course, sometimes the art on gravestones really reflects, more than anything else, the taste of the individual. And that's really interesting to me in learning about who the people were who used these cemeteries. The image in the center, this is a cast zinc monument. And when you would pre-order this from a catalog, and you could choose whatever image you want. And this farmer in southeast Indiana, Dearborn County, had a corn cob on one side and a sheaf of wheat on the other. He was proud to be a farmer, evidently. That was part of his identity. That was how he wanted to be remembered. It's not a good photograph on the right, but you see a lot of Masonic imagery because that really is part of somebody's identity, the fraternal organizations they belong to. You'll see symbols for the Odd Fellows or any number of these other fraternal lodges. Moving away from the individual, if you start looking at the broader landscape in these cemeteries, you see how they fit into artistic or cultural trends in American history. Graveyards in colonial America were not supposed to be anything but utilitarian spaces. You had somebody who had passed away, you had to give them the last rites and put them in the ground. You'd carve a skull and crossbones on the tombstone to say, remember, you will die too one day. That was kind of the puritanical idea. As cemeteries spread into Ohio, the really stark, harsh imagery of death started to soften a little bit. People started to see cemeteries as a space where you would want to go and mourn and be soothed by beautiful trees, by nature. And eventually that idea coalesced into what we call the rural cemetery movement, which suggested that cemeteries should be like public parks. They should have these winding drives and beautiful art and beautiful trees and flowers and landscaping. And a mound was a perfect thing to integrate into that kind of very, aestheticized artistic landscape. Up there in Oak Hill Cemetery in Millersburg, that's Holmes County, the mound sits, as a lot of mounds do, right on the top of this hill, which has been turned into a cemetery. You walk up a little set of stairs onto a viewing platform on the top of the mound, and you have this wonderful commanding view of the landscape. And I think it's really interesting to see the way the mound has been integrated into that idea of this specific ituration of American cemetery design. As an aside, I really think Mound Cemetery in Marietta presaged a lot of the rural cemetery movement, even though it was 30 years prior to the rural cemetery coming to America, just in the way that people were thinking about wanting a visual centerpiece in that cemetery, wanting the interest and the drama and the beauty of an antique monument planted with beautiful trees. If there's any cemetery scholars in the room, I think that might be a fruitful avenue for further exploration. So cemeteries are necessarily religious landscapes. Every religion in the world has ideas about the metaphysical implications of death and afterlives and how we, the living, relate to the dead. So the image on the right, I think this is kind of implicit. The way that little Presbyterian church in Licking County was built right next to this big, beautiful mound. Visually, they balance one another. It seems to be that this new sacred structure, this church, is visually referencing this ancient sacred structure, this mound. Or maybe that's just my interpretation. But the image on the left, the religious imagery, is significantly more explicit. This is in St. Joseph's Cemetery in Lockbourne, just south of Columbus on Route 23. And the mound here has been turned into a very potent, direct image of Mount Calvary. You've got this statue of Jesus on the cross on the mound, like that's Calvary from the biblical account. So sometimes the mound cemeteries are quite explicitly Christian landscapes. At other times, it's less religious in the common sense that we think about it, and rather religious in what geographers and other scholars refer to as civic religion, which is the idea that we as a nation have sets of rituals and mythologies that bind us together as a nation, that help us tell our story, and that function kind of in similar ways to other systems of religion. A lot of mound cemeteries are quite closely associated with veterans, and veterans play a very important role in the American national sense of identity. Very, very often, if there's somebody buried on the top of the mound, it's the local Revolutionary War hero. That's the case in Piketon, in Jackson, and in Finneytown is a suburb of Cincinnati. You have the Revolutionary veteran right on top of the mound or right in front of the mound. If there's no Revolutionary vet in the cemetery, your next vet is 1812, and so on up through the Civil War. And that's a place of pride, right? Just visually, you see this beautiful high elevation that's a focus of attention. That's the natural place to put an important person. If we get historical again here, the 1820s are an interesting time in American history. Now we take it for granted that we memorialize veterans, that we memorialize battles and battlefields, but Americans did not always do that. The first battlefield memorial to be put up anywhere in this country was the Bunker Hill Monument in Boston in 1824. So we're back in the 1820s, we're back in New England. That is where that cultural idea arose before spreading out throughout the country. And I really think that the war memorials and the veterans' graves that you find in mound cemeteries reflect that trend. That's a small version of a war monument. You have your local honored dead, the person in your community that you knew had fought in the Revolutionary War and has now passed away. You're going to turn this mound, this ancient monument, into a monument now for this local war hero. So, aside from the veterans themselves, the forms that this take, very often a flagpole. You have a nice patch of high ground, center of attention. You're going to put the flagpole there. We saw that at St. Sylvester's Cemetery. We see it again here in Dillsboro, Indiana. Sometimes, though, it's a more elaborate war memorial. This one up in Newark started as a Civil War monument. That's the kind of marble component in the center. 50 years later, 60 years later, the brick wings were added to commemorate conflicts from the Revolution up through Desert Storm. And it sits right in front of this mound in a public park that used to be a cemetery. So that is an implicit way to interpret the mounds, to say they have some significance. We are going to associate them with things that we consider significant, with our war heroes. Very occasionally in mound cemeteries, you find interpretation that is a little more explicit. So sometimes that's as simple as the place name. Calling it Mound Cemetery draws attention to the fact that there's a mound there, of course. There's a lot of cemeteries that are simply named Mound Cemetery, which makes it confusing because I always talk about Marietta's Mound Cemetery. And if you say Mound Cemetery to somebody from Ohio, that's probably the place they think of. They don't think of Howard County, Indiana, necessarily. But you see that as a place name a lot. Sometimes you actually see historic signage, which I think is a great thing as somebody who likes, the interpretation of history and the landscape. You go to Mound Cemetery in Marietta, and yes, great, you get some information about the mound builders, about the cultures who first used that site. It's only rare, though. You don't see a lot of historical signage in these sites, which to me is a shame. I think that people love to see ancient history. They love to see it in their own area. And if you have a mound cemetery, in your county, well, that's a mound you can go see. If you want to go see a 2,000-year-old ancient site, it'd be cool if there were more signs that help people interpret those sites. Which brings me to, just thoughts on what is the place of the Mound Cemetery in our cultural landscape, in our present time. They are still being used for burial. A lot of people are very surprised to learn that. In most cases, burials are not being made in the mounds themselves. But in a couple of them, yes, we do find places where people still own grave plots on the land that actually is occupied by the mound. One of them is at Morrison Cemetery in Adams County. And I mentioned the Wyandotte Mission Cemetery in this slide on kind of the present and future of mound cemeteries because, how we as Americans descended from European settlers, how we interact with and interpret native sites, that question, that topic has been really very, very much in the public discourse in recent years. The Wyandotte Mission Cemetery in Sandusky County, Ohio, Wyandotte County, Ohio, my bad, it's in Upper Sandusky, is just an interesting example of a place where a site that is sacred to Native peoples. This was the Wyandottes Reservation up until the 1840s. The Wyandottes who lived there had converted to Methodism. They built this little church. They eventually were removed west of the Mississippi. But a couple years back, I think it was 2019, something like that, the United Methodist Church actually returned that parcel of land, about an acre with a church and cemetery, to the Wyandotte Nation. And from the people I've spoken to up at it's still run by volunteers from the local Methodist Church and I think from the local Historical Society. They have glowing things to say about how things have gone since the land was actually transferred back to the Wyandottes, how the maintenance is so much better, there's money for maintenance, there's money for interpretive programming. So all I mean to say is these sites do not necessarily have to be sites of conflict between the interests of different cultures or anything like that. In Wisconsin, a lot of them have become sites of conflict. That's a separate story. There's mound cemeteries up there too. We haven't seen so much conflict in Ohio. What I want to leave you with is items of local interest. I just picked the two mound cemeteries closest to Portsmouth, neither of which is necessarily immediately visually impressive. So if you drive out Route 52 west of Portsmouth, you'll come to, you'll miss it if you're not looking for it. You can actually see it from the highway if you know what you're looking for. This little mound at one point had 4 or 5 graves of members of the Morrison family in it. I actually spoke to the lady who lives in the house next door. And according to her version of the story, half of the mound was graves of historic period Shawnee Indians, half of the mound was graves of the Morrison family, which is itself, that's some very interesting folklore, whether it's true or not. The stones are all missing. According to the lady I spoke to, they have been stolen. But that's not far from Portsmouth. On the other side of Portsmouth, if you drive out to the east, it's funny, they're both in Greene Township, just different counties. There's a church. I'm trying to remember what the road is. There's the Pine Creek Baptist Church. Cemetery behind that church. According to the Ohio Archaeological Inventory's records of archaeological sites in Scioto County, there's supposed to be a mound in that cemetery. I couldn't find one. But the whole cemetery is this raised elevation of land above the floodplain of Pine Creek. It really doesn't look anything like a mound. So it's hard to imagine how historic settlers might have interpreted that site as a mound, but it's not the only place where a landform that really does not look like a mound was interpreted as such. So that could be what was going on there. There's also cemeteries, of course, sometimes where there was a mound and the mound at some point in history was destroyed. And so there's an archaeological record of a mound having been there, but you can't see it today. So if anybody in the audience knows anything about Pine Creek Cemetery, I'd love to hear from you. But in any case, that's my last slide, is just the local interest. So if anybody has any questions or wants me to go back to any picture that came up before or anything,
You could go back about 5 slides.
yeah, tell me when.
For your signage, that one right there. Meyer Manor, you didn't really mention that. So that's just an example of the signage.
Yeah, it's a place where there's a family name attached to it and also the name Mound Cemetery. Indiana's great for actually signing their historic cemeteries. They do it much better than Ohio does. This one is in Lake County, which is the farthest northwest corner of Indiana. It's not an actual mound. It's an ancient lakeshore dune or a glacial formation or something. But historically, it's been interpreted as a mound. It goes back to the 1830s, and it actually was New England settlers. Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying that. So if you find one of your slides that has your Ohio and Indiana maps of your concept.
Yeah, let me find one of those. Well, I'll go and show you both of them.
That one would have been fine.
Oh, well, there you are.
Okay. So comparing that to that Mills map, the one on the right, you had that slide that had that.
Yeah. There you are. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you overlay your settlement of the various pioneer groups, and you say, well, New Englanders are responsible for the most of that, and they're up on the top in the north, people in the south. That's not the way the mound concentration has been uneven.
Right.
So how did you put that into your equation?
Okay. Thanks for asking, because that is an important point of clarification. I was able to establish I was able to ascertain who established almost all of my cemeteries. A few of them I couldn't, and I was able to say, all right, we look at Ames Township, Athens County. There's 2 mound cemeteries there, both started by, only one of them, started by somebody I could find who came out of New England. The other was an immigrant directly from England. So I have another version of this map that is color-coded according to settler groups that shows almost all the ones in the Western Reserve are actually New Englanders. And then the swath of New England established mound cemeteries runs from the Western Reserve down through, like in kind of an arc shape, through the Ohio Company Purchase, which also had a lot of New England settlement. You have an arc of southern established mound cemeteries roughly following what is now US 35 through here. Hamilton County is all over the place. There's only a couple of mid-Atlantic / Pennsylvania established mound cemeteries.
So my question on this is, this is perfect because you have all the townships up there. Everything to the east of the Saddle River was surveyed differently
Yes.
than Western survey.
And you can really see that, yes.
And that you can see that in the township area. How did that seem to affect your study? Because I would imagine that the people settling in the Virginia Military District, all veteran, claimed land early on, is probably going to be different a settlement pattern than.
It is different settlement patterns. You tend to.
How locations for cemeteries are selected is going to be different.
Well, your settlers coming out of Virginia and Kentucky were a little bit more likely to disperse their cemeteries kind of widely across the landscape. Every family have their own cemetery on their farm. But that effect, at least in the cemeteries I've looked at, that's only a minor effect. You see little individual family cemeteries in the New England areas, even though overall more of their cemeteries were centered in a community and used by lots of different families. If we look at the Scioto Valley, Piketon and Richmonddale, neither of those is a family cemetery. Those are both used by a broader local community. In Pickaway County, this is the Herenstein Cemetery. That was 2 or 3 families who lived and farmed in a small neighborhood. And so that's more typical, really. If you were just going to do a study on cemeteries in the Western Reserve, that's the typical one. As far as...
The reason I bring it up, just to kind of cut the chase of this, what I found when I was researching my book is that in the earliest settlement of Ohio, many of the places that were first settled were settled by war veterans.
Yes.
And they purposely went out of their way to claim property for themselves where there were mounds and earthworks. And you see that particularly in the Virginia Military District.
Yes. Well, I'd be interested to read more about whatever documentation is actually people saying, yeah, I want to claim this mound site.
Well, you can see it in the land records, particularly.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think people were attracted to them. I think that, I make a big deal out of New Englanders, but they were not the only ones doing it. They have the highest incidence, but we know that a lot of settlers coming out of Virginia were also interested in the classical world. You think of Thomas Jefferson, whoever, Thomas Worthington.
It's that Cincinnati Society of
Veterans. Worthington built his summer house on a mound in what's now downtown Chillicothe, right? So a mound was a salient point in the landscape. It was a point of aesthetic interest, of historic interest, of romantic interest. And putting your cemetery there is only one expression of how you're going to adapt that landscape to your own view of the world, your own wishes, whatever it may be. Maybe I'll have to do a PhD looking at the finer detail of how that expressed itself in the Virginia Military District versus the Ohio Company Purchase versus the U.S. Military District above Zanesville, whatever. Like, that would be interesting to study.
And I think that might partly explain why there are certain concentrations in certain given areas. That whole Cincinnati, Hamilton County area where you've got a huge concentration over there, that was a completely different land purchase, right? From
Sims Purchase, yes.
Yeah, Sims Purchase from New Jersey. And the way in which, William Henry Harrison became that guy's son-in-law, large military presence, military fort there,
right.
A lot of veterans.
You have to consider about Hamilton County. It was Ohio's most populous county until 1900.
Yeah.
I mean, what interests me is that there are no mound cemeteries in Cincinnati proper. They form this arc in what is today the suburbs of Cincinnati, but at the time would have been the rural hinterland of Cincinnati. And I don't quite know how to explain that. But yeah, Hamilton County is a very interesting case. And certainly part of the concentration there has to just be explained by the fact that it was, for most of the 19th century, much more populous than any other county in Ohio. But there's probably other cultural factors at play too. Pam, yeah.
I know in Fayette County, up there in the corner, the one in Fayette County.
This one here?
Now I know why they said they think they built the cemetery on top of the Indian Man. It was built on a glacial cane, and they thought that probably in that area it was easier for to dig in and bury the people in it.
Well, that's true, yeah. Loosely consolidated glacial sediment. I mean, you can't rule out the practical factors there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very small cemetery.
That Mills McKillop, is that the one that?
It's near Pleasant View, so
yeah.
I think that's what it
okay,
is.
yeah.
It's Pleasant View.
How certain are you that your map is comprehensive?
I would be very surprised if it was comprehensive. I based my map on, I was able to get a spreadsheet from the Ohio Archaeological Inventory of archaeological sites in the state and kind of comb through see which ones were associated with historic cemeteries, but that probably provided maybe 60% of what you see there. I looked through findagrave.com and just did keyword searches for mound or mounds, and turned up a list of cemeteries that had mound in the name, drove to visit each one to see, and looked at available historic sources. In the 1860s, 70s, 80s, there was this cultural movement to publish these exhaustive, very, very Victorian style county histories, but those mention a lot of mound cemeteries. So I actually got a lot doing just keyword searches on digitized versions of those, and people telling me about, hey, check out this cemetery. I think there might be a mound there. Andy Tremaine is the archaeologist for the Wayne National Forest. He was very helpful to me in just turning up places he'd heard of that might be, So no, I would be very surprised if I'd found all of the Mound Cemetery sites, and I've never really stopped finding them. As I've done this project, it's always a process of, I got to add one more in, because they just keep cropping up. You look at Indiana, and see how much. I do think there are fewer mound cemeteries in Indiana. I don't think the ratio is quite as stark as it appears to be here. I am less familiar with the state of Indiana, and so I probably have found fewer of them there, even though I also got some very good data for Indiana and spoke to some very helpful people there too.
I have another comment.
Well, yeah.
When I was doing research at Harvard on Serpent Mound, I came across two unpublished maps of the park when Harvard took over. And on both maps, they record historic burials in the park, and dating back to the 1820s.
That's very interesting.
So Serpent Mound may be another one.
Yeah.
That's not generally recognized.
Well, I'd love to see
a little bit about it. I did an academia. There's a paper in academia that I included.
Oh, okay. Is the map in the paper? Yeah. I'd love to see the map. Yeah. That very, very. I mean, because Serpent Mound has caught people's attention for a long time.
So it's not generally a cemetery per se, but was maybe turning into one before it kind of got stopped for some reason.
Well, and a lot of these are very small. 1, 2, 3, 10 people on a mound site that just a family used for a couple of decades. And so if whoever owned that tract of land was burying family members there for a period of time,
What's interesting is the information recorded on the map had this. It was some reverend, and they gave his birth information as he lived X number of years, days, months, which is sometimes recorded on headstones.
Right.
So they must have got that information off of the headstone that had existed there. The headstone no longer exists. But
that's very interesting. Yeah, I'll definitely have to look that up. That's cool. Anybody else have any questions before we adjourn for the evening? Jeb, are you looking at me quizzically or just okay? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all.